China's birth rate has fallen to its lowest level in more than 7 decades, despite government efforts to arrest this decline. Around 10.6 million babies were born last year, down from the 12 million in 2020. That's a rate of around 7.5 per 1,000 people and marks the 5th straight year of decline. The figure also barely outnumbers the number of deaths, which came in at around 10.1 million. Beijing has already taken steps to curb the trend, allowing couples to have a third child and reducing abortions for, quote, non-medical purposes. But it's unclear how effective the measures have been. The move has also been met with strong resistance from young adults. Many say childbirth has become almost synonymous with the stress of life. And for a closer look, Professor Stuart Geetle-Barson, visiting fellow at Erasmus University, joins us live. Professor, let's talk about measures specifically in China, because the most known is the one-child policy. In fact, declining fertility in China predated the launch of that policy in 1979. And more worryingly for officials now, after it officially ended in 2015, it's still the declining fertility continues, as we have seen, falling year after year, 5 years of declines. If we look at government measures, whether they're pro or anti-reproduction, how would you assess the efficacy?
Well, so of course, in terms of the process of fertility decline, the one-child policy wasn't the only thing that happened in China in the 1980s, and the family planning policy in the 70s wasn't the only thing. So in that sense, the fertility decline was a response both to policy which is explicitly related to family planning, but then other things as well, such as urbanization and economic development, female empowerment, and so on. And really, it's exactly in the same way that we should think about recent changes to the two-child policy and the three-child policy. That, again, these are not the only things which have happened in China over the last decades. And when we look at the context of family formation and childbearing now, and again, it's not just childbearing, but getting into relationships, getting married, of course, it's not only family planning which is important. We have to look at the broader context of just the challenges and the difficulties of starting, building and growing a family in China today.
So a number of factors then that underscore the reasons why couples and perhaps women in particular don't want to become mothers too soon. But we do know that a long-term decline in adults of working age, that's going to pose a problem, an economic problem for China eventually. What ripple effects might we see perhaps in the Asia Pacific should this population dilemma for China continue?
Well, yeah, there's one thing which we're very certain of, is that the die is cast in terms of population aging and population stagnation and decline in the medium to long term. So the question is about how China will respond to that. And this, in terms of this ripple effect. If China does nothing, then obviously there's going to be a lot of challenges with regard to public financing, but also with regard to kind of economic growth and social well-being. But that doesn't appear to be the case. China is responding very proactively to these changes. And again, it's not just about the birth policy, it's not just about family policy, but in terms of in dealing with pension reform, retirement reform, improving productivity, and so on. So, China is actually in a relatively it's not in as bad a position as I think that many of the headlines make out to be, because of course, yes, the population is older and is declining, but the population is also healthier, more highly educated, more skilled, more adaptable to technology. So the key is in China, as elsewhere in the region, whether it's in Singapore, whether it's in Japan, in South Korea, in Hong Kong, the key is actually trying to maximize the potential of all citizens, of all of the population, rather than just banking on trying to get more and more people.
All right, Professor, I'll bring it back to what my colleague mentioned about working age adults. So essentially, it doesn't really matter in terms of crude numbers. What you need is a large working age population relative to the number of dependents we have, whether they're too young or too old to contribute to the national economy. And as you mentioned, if this working age population has its quality improved, so better health, better education. Given that this picture of declining birth rates, declining numbers of young adults is affecting the entire world, largely speaking, the World Bank has said fertility rates fallen by almost half since by 2018, the last 50 years. Now, what we might do, rather than encouraging people to have more babies, might be to improve the young people that we do have and to reduce the dependency of those who are older. Is that the way to go?
Exactly. You have to look at this in a multidimensional way. That we want to have people who are in work to be as productive as possible and working in decent employment for as long as they are able to. But then we also, of course, want to have younger people to have education and skills and training, which will enable them to be as productive as possible when they enter the workforce and give them jobs to do. And then also when we look at, as you say, in terms of the older population, we, of course, want the older population to be as healthy as possible, to be as active as possible, and to be contributing. And it's not just about working pushing back the retirement ages, being able to maximise the contribution of the older population for as long as possible. So that's the thing. If we just focus in on having more babies, really that doesn't solve anything. It will just make the population bigger unless we actually tackle some of these institutional issues and we look at this from a life course perspective. Then really we're not going to fix any of the underlying challenges which population aging and slow population growth bring.
And meantime, Professor, we are in the middle of a global pandemic. So how far has that sort of thrown this population dilemma, sort of off course as well?
Yeah, so that's a very, very important issue at the moment. And that's why of course, the short-term consequence around the world is that we can see in China as elsewhere that where fertility rates are already low, the pandemic has pushed them lower, generally speaking. That's as a consequence of, all of the challenges of the last couple of years of economic and social instability, of challenges to jobs and employment, to the lockdown, the challenges of people already with children, the challenges of being able to manage work and life have become accentuated. But on the other hand, as well, what we see in many parts of the world where fertility is rather higher, the pandemic has actually pushed up fertility rates. And again, that's because of in many cases, the first people to lose their jobs are females in many of these parts of the world, which means that there is a kind of decline in decision-making power in the household. Also, if health and family planning systems are fragile, then these can be the first. Then the consequence of this can be higher fertility rates and also higher incidences of gender-based violence and so on. So really, demographically speaking, around the world, we see a very mixed picture in the sense that the COVID pandemic has kind of exaggerated the existing inequalities, inequities, and structural challenges that we see around the world.
Oh, thanks so much for that. Professor Stuart Gietel-Bassen from Erasmus University.